Before you spend money on a laptop or a PC, here is the most useful thing I can tell you. The badge on the lid, HP, Lenovo, Dell, Asus, Acer, is the least important part of what you are buying. What matters is the components inside and whether the machine can actually keep them running. By the end of this video, you will be able to read any spec sheet and tell in about 30 seconds whether it is a good deal or a trap.
We are going to go through all of it. Processor names, and why the i5 in a model number confuses almost everyone. Graphics, and the real difference between integrated and dedicated. VRAM versus system RAM. The wattage number that manufacturers quietly leave off the spec sheet. Screens, cooling, MacBooks, and how to put together a desktop. And one thing specific to 2026 that changes almost every recommendation in this video.
Let's start with brand. Most laptops are not built by the company whose name is on the lid. A small group of contract manufacturers, Quanta, Compal, Wistron, Climo, build machines for many competing brands, very often on shared reference designs. Two laptops from two rival companies can come out of the same factory, sharing the same chassis, the same hinge, and the same cooling layout.
So what does the brand actually decide? Real things, but not the ones people assume. How good the warranty is, and whether service is on-site or you have to carry the machine in yourself. How far the service network reaches from where you actually live, firmware and BIOS quality, and how long you keep getting updates, and how much pre-installed junk you inherit on day one.
Which gives you a clean rule for the whole video. Brand decides support. Components decide speed. So choose the chassis on service, cooling, and screen quality. Choose the performance on the silicon inside. And never choose either one on the logo.
Laptops come in three species, and mixing them up is the single most expensive mistake buyers make. Thin and light office machines, performance machines, which get sold to you as gaming laptops, and MacBooks, which play by their own rules entirely. Office laptops are genuinely good at what they are built for. Documents, spreadsheets, email, browsing, video calls, watching films. If that is your work, a well-chosen thin and light with 16 gigabytes of memory and a full sRGB screen will feel fast for years and last all day on battery. You do not need to spend more than that, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. Now the part the marketing gets wrong. A gaming laptop is not only for gaming. That label just means a lot of sustained compute, a dedicated graphics chip, and real cooling, which is exactly what you need for video editing and color work, photo editing, 3D and Blender, VFX, running AI models on your own machine, and game development. If you do any of those, you are shopping in this category, whether or not you ever play a game. So can an office laptop do that work? No, and I do not mean it will be a little slower. A thin and light has no dedicated graphics memory to hold your textures or your model weights, and no cooling mask to hold a heavy load for more than a few minutes. It is the wrong tool, not a slow one. No amount of patience fixes that.
Here is the mechanism. Every laptop really has two performance numbers, what it does in the first minute and what it settles down to after 30. Marketing quotes the first one. You live with the second one. On a thin chassis under a long render or a long compile, the gap between those two numbers is the whole story. MacBooks are the third species. One chip with the processor, the graphics, and the memory fused into a single package, which makes them very efficient and very quiet. The Air has no fan at all, so it throttles once a load runs long. The Pro has fans, so it does not. That one difference is the entire Air versus Pro decision, and we will come back to it properly. The catch? That fused memory can never be upgraded, so what you buy is what you keep.
One more thing before we get into components, and it is specific to right now. There is a global memory shortage driven by AI demand. DDR5 memory is selling between $11 and $13 per gigabyte. The last time memory cost that much per gigabyte was 2008. JP Morgan put the increase at more than 400% since the start of 2024. And in June, Apple raised the price of every Mac because of it. That flips the usual advice completely. Normally, you buy a cheaper machine and add memory and storage later when parts are cheaper. Right now, later is more expensive than now, and analysts do not expect real relief before 2028. So the rule for this year is simple. Buy the memory and the storage you actually need on the day you buy the machine. And check whether it is upgradable at all, because a lot of thin laptops solder it down. Right, components. We start with the processor, and with the one number that confuses more buyers than anything else on the entire spec sheet.
Here is the confusion that costs people the most money. Someone tells you they bought an i5. You ask which generation, and they do not know there is a difference. Because in the name Core i5-13420H, there are two completely separate numbers doing two completely separate jobs.
Let us take it apart. The 5 is the tier. It tells you roughly how much processor you are getting, i3, i5, i7, i9. The 13 is the generation. It tells you how new the design is. 13th generation launched in 2023. The next 3 digits place it within that tier. And the letter on the end is the power class, which we will come back to, because it matters more than most people realize.
Now the important bit. Tier and generation are independent. So which is faster, a 13th generation i5 or a 10th generation i7? Usually the newer i5. 3 generations of progress beats 1 step up the tier ladder, which means a bigger number in the tier does not rescue an old design. And this is exactly how old stock gets sold to people at prices it does not deserve.
So here is every generation, so you can place any machine you were shown. First generation, 2008. Second generation, Sandy Bridge, 2011. Famously large jump. Then Ivy Bridge, Haswell, Broadwell, Skylake, Cabby Lake. 8th generation in 2017 is where core counts finally went up. Then Comet Lake, Rocket Lake, and 12th generation Alder Lake in 2022, which brought the split between performance and efficiency cores and DDR5. 13th and 14th generation, 2023. And then the naming changes completely.
In 2023, Intel retired the I naming entirely. There is no i3, i5, i7, or i9 anymore. The higher tiers are now Core Ultra 5, 7, and 9. Below them, plain Core 3, 5, and 7. And instead of generations, they are counted in series. Series 1 was Meteor Lake. Series 2 was Lunar Lake and Arrow Lake. Series 3 is what you are being sold right now.
Series 3, codename Panther Lake, launched in January 2026 on Intel's 18A process. Model numbers are 3 digits now, not 4 or 5, 336H up to 388H. 2 things worth knowing. These chips drop hyperthreading entirely, and the neural processor goes up to 50 TOPS, which matters for the Copilot features Windows keeps advertising.
And here is the new trap. Some of these are called Core Ultra X9 or X7. That X is not a bigger processor. It means the good integrated graphics, 12 Z-cores badged as ARC. Without the X, you get 4 Z-cores, and it is just called Intel Graphics. Same tier number, 3 times the graphics. And it only earns the ARC badge if the laptop's memory is fast enough, so 2 machines with the same chip name can still differ.
Now that letter at the end, because it decides more than the tier does. U is about 15 watts, built for thin and light. P is around 28. H is about 45 for performance laptops. HX is 55 and up, essentially desktop silicon in a big chassis. So a Core Ultra 7U and a Core Ultra 7HX are not close to each other. Same tier, completely different machines.
One honest caveat. Those wattages are nominal classes, not guarantees. What the chip actually sustains is set by the laptop's cooling and the maker's power limits, not by the letter. 2 laptops with the identical H chip can perform noticeably differently, and the thinner one loses. The letter tells you what the chip is designed for. The chassis tells you what you will actually get.
One warning if you buy used, and I want to be precise about it because a lot of people get this wrong. Some 13th and 14th generation Intel desktop processors suffered a real degradation problem. Intel traced it to a circuit inside the core that ages under high voltage and heat. The critical detail? Damage already done cannot be undone by a software update. The fix only prevents more of it. So if you buy a used 13th or 14th generation desktop chip, ask whether the board was on current firmware and default power settings. Laptops are not affected by this, only desktop parts.
Now, AMD. The tiers mirror Intel. Ryzen 3, 5, 7, and 9. Same idea, roughly how much processor. First, one piece of terminology, because it confuses people constantly. Ryzen is AMD's processor brand. Radeon is their graphics brand. There is no such thing as a Ryzen graphics card. An AMD laptop pairs a Ryzen processor with Radeon integrated graphics, and separately might add a discrete card from either AMD or NVIDIA.
AMD's laptop numbering is honestly worse than Intel's. Take Ryzen 7 7840U. The first 7 is the model year. The 8 is the tier. The 4 is the Zen generation. That is the number that actually tells you how modern the cores are. The 0 is a variant, and U is the power class. So the digit that matters most is the third one, buried in the middle. Nobody guesses that. You just have to know. Current AMD is Zen 5. On laptops, that is Ryzen AI 300 and Ryzen AI Max for the high-end. On desktop, it is Ryzen 9000. And a scheduling note that matters if you're thinking of waiting. Zen 6 is not out. Data center parts are expected late 2026 and desktop in the first half of 2027. If you need a machine now, waiting for Zen 6 is not a plan. The good news is that when it does arrive, it stays on the same AM5 socket, which makes AM5 the safer platform to build on today. Third option, and it is genuinely new, ARM-based Windows laptops running Qualcomm Snapdragon chips. The current family is Snapdragon X2 Elite, X2 Elite Extreme, and a mid-tier X2 Plus, which all arrived around the start of 2026. The appeal is real. Excellent battery life, silent running, and a strong neural processor. Windows runs older x86 software through an emulation layer called Prism, and most mainstream applications are now either native or run well. But here is the honest catch, and vendors will not lead with it. Anti-cheat is still patchy. Epic did ship easy anti-cheat support for Windows on ARM, but whether any given multiplayer game works still depends on that game's developer opting in. Beyond games, the risk is a specific plugin, a driver, or a piece of hardware you own that nobody ever ported. So the rule is simple. Buy an ARM laptop only if you can name the software you depend on and you have checked it. If you cannot make that list, buy x86.
So what should you actually optimize for? It depends entirely on your software, and this is where most advice goes wrong. Spreadsheets and most everyday apps lean on one fast core, so clock speed and single-core performance win. Rendering, exporting video, and compiling code scale across everything you have, so core count wins. Games mostly want 6 to 8 genuinely fast cores, plus a lot of cache, and stop caring above that. Buying a 24-core processor to run Excel faster does nothing at all.
One more number you will see everywhere, T-tops from the neural processor. Microsoft's Copilot Plus batch requires at least 40 T-tops. Two things to keep straight. It gates some on-device features, like live captions and image tools. It is not a general speed rating, and it will not make your video export faster. That is still the graphics chip's job. And if your interest is running large language models on your own machine, the NPU is not what does that either. That comes down to graphics memory, which is the next section. So the processor, condensed. Read the generation, not just the tier. Read the letter on the end, because it sets the power class. Remember that the chassis decides what that power actually becomes. On AMD, the third digit is the one that tells you the architecture. Do not wait for next year's chips, and match cores and clocks to the software you actually run. Get those right, and you have already avoided most bad laptop purchases.
Next, graphics. The single component that decides whether a machine can do creative work at all, and the place where the spec sheets are least honest with you.
There are two kinds of graphics in a computer, and the difference is physical, not a setting. Integrated graphics are built into the processor itself, and they have no memory of their own. They borrow from your system RAM. A dedicated graphics chip is a separate piece of silicon with its own memory soldered right next to it and its own power budget. This one component is what actually separates an office laptop from a creator laptop. Not the brand, not the price, not how aggressive the lid looks. If there is no dedicated graphics chip with its own memory, the machine cannot do the heavy work, and no amount of processor will compensate. Now, the single most confused pair of specs in this entire hobby, VRAM and System RAM, are not the same thing, and they are not interchangeable. System RAM is your computer's working memory. VRAM is the graphics chip's own private memory, and it is the thing that holds your textures, your video timeline cache, and the weights of any AI model you run locally. 16 gigabytes of system RAM does not help a graphics chip that only has 6 gigabytes of VRAM. So how much do you need? For gaming in 2026, 8 gigabytes is the floor, 12 is comfortable at 1440p, and 16 is what you want for 4K and serious creative work. For running language models on your own machine, the rules of thumb are roughly a 7 billion parameter model at 4-bit quantization needs about 5 to 6 gigabytes, 13 billion needs about 9 to 10, 30 billion needs 20, and 70 billion needs 40 or more, which is beyond every consumer laptop graphics chip on the market.
Now let me correct something you will see repeated constantly in comments and in shop listings. There is no RTX 3050 with 11 or 12 gigabytes of VRAM. It does not exist. The laptop 3050 shipped with 4 or 6. The desktop card was 8 and later a 6 gigabyte version. If someone quotes you a 12 gigabyte 3050, they have confused it with something else, and usually that something else is the desktop 3060.
And that comparison is genuinely worth doing properly because it teaches the whole lesson. Desktop 3060 with 12 gigabytes against laptop 4050 with 6. The 4050 is the newer, faster chip, and it supports frame generation, which the 3060 does not. But the 3060 has double the memory. So the 4050 wins on raw speed right up until you hit something that does not fit in 6 gigabytes. 1440p ultra textures, a 4K timeline, a 13 billion parameter model, and then it does not just slow down, it stops being able to do the job. Faster chip, smaller memory. The wall decides.
Here is the current laptop lineup, so you can place any machine. 5050, 8 gigabytes, and note it uses the older GDDR6 memory rather than GDDR7 like the rest. 5060, 8. 5070, and this one needs care. It launched with 8, and in April this year, NVIDIA quietly added a 12 gigabyte version without any announcement. Same name, very different card. 5070 Ti, 12. 5080, 16. 5090, 24.
And now, the most useful thing in this entire video. Knowing the GPU name is not enough because the same name ships at wildly different power levels. It is called Total Graphics Power, TGP, and it is measured in watts. An RTX 5070 in a laptop can be configured anywhere from roughly 50 watts to 115. Notebook Check measured the maximum clock on that same chip varying from 1425 MHz to 2347, purely depending on the laptop's cooling and power limits. So, how much does that actually matter? Reviewers measure roughly 15 to 20% difference in frame rate on the same 5070 between a slim chassis and a thick one. That is a bigger swing than almost any processor difference on the same spec sheet, and unlike the processor, it is usually not printed anywhere. I want to be careful here. You will see much larger numbers quoted online. 15 to 20% is what is actually measured for this chip.
So how do you find it? Check the fine print in the full spec sheet, not the marketing page. Look for a graphics power figure in watts. If the seller cannot tell you, ask them, and treat not knowing as a bad sign. Review databases list measured figures for specific models. While you're in there, look for 2 more things: dynamic boost, which lets the machine shift power between processor and graphics, and a mux switch, which routes the display straight to the dedicated chip instead of passing it through the integrated one. Both are free performance if the laptop has them.
A quick word on the alternatives, and I am going to be blunt about the state of it. In discrete laptop graphics, NVIDIA is effectively unopposed right now. AMD's laptop Radeon cards are rare and mostly turn up in external enclosures in mini PCs, and their newer architecture was deprioritized on mobile. You will find leaked specs for an RX 9000M family online. Those are leaks, not shipping products, so do not plan a purchase around them. Where AMD genuinely does matter on laptops is integrated graphics, which are now good enough for real-light gaming. And Intel's newer integrated graphics, the ARC-badged ones, are finally in the same conversation.
One more consideration if your work is AI or 3D rather than gaming. NVIDIA's software layer, CUDA, is still the path of least resistance on Windows. More tools assume it, and more of them work the first time you install them. AMD's equivalent has improved, but coverage on Windows is narrower. This is not a statement about which chip is faster. It is about which one your specific software actually supports. So check your own application list before you pick a side.
You will see enormous frame rate claims attached to these cards, and they need context. Upscaling and frame generation are genuinely useful features, but frame generation inserts generated frames. It raises the number on screen without making the game respond any faster, so it does not fix input latency, and it needs a decent base frame rate to look clean. NVIDIA's claim that a 5070 matches a 4090 only holds with 4 times frame generation at the lowest quality preset. Do not choose a graphics card on that number.
And one detail that matters specifically if you edit or stream. The current NVIDIA cards carry a 9th generation encoder. They handle AV1, and for the first time on a consumer GeForce card, they can encode and decode 422 color. If you work with footage from a decent camera, that last one is the difference between smooth editing and transcoding everything first.
Graphics, condensed.
Confirm there is a dedicated chip at all. Read the exact VRAM figure. And remember, one name can mean two different cards. Find the TGP in watts and walk away from a seller who will not tell. Check for a mux switch. Ignore frame generation marketing numbers and size the VRAM to the largest thing you actually intend to open.
Next, memory and storage, which in 2026 is the most expensive decision on the whole spec sheet.
Memory and storage. In any other year, this would be the boring section. Buy 16 gigabytes, buy a solid-state drive, move on. This year, it is the section where the most money is at stake because the rules that everybody learned over the last decade have just been turned upside down.
Here is the scale of it in the industry's own figures. In the first quarter of 2026, DRAM contract prices rose 90 to 95% compared with the previous quarter. Flash memory rose 55 to 60% in the same 3 months. Gartner expects the two combined to be up around 130% by the end of this year and coined a word for it, memflation. Nobody serious expects real relief before 2028.
So how much do you actually need? 16 gigabytes is the floor in 2026, not the comfortable amount, the floor, below which a browser and one real application will start swapping to disk. 32 is the number for editing video, working with raw photos, or compiling code. 64 and above belongs to visual effects work and to running large models locally. Pick the row that matches the biggest thing you will actually open, not the biggest thing you can imagine.
Now, a detail that costs nothing and is missed constantly. 2 smaller sticks are faster than 1 large stick of the same total size. Memory runs in channels, and filling 2 channels roughly doubles the bandwidth compared with filling 1. 16 gigabytes as 2/8 beats 16 gigabytes as a single stick. This matters most on a laptop with integrated graphics because those graphics have no memory of their own and are reading from that same bus. A single-stick budget laptop is quietly slower at everything graphical. Before you buy, find out how the memory is physically attached. If it sits in SO-DIMM slots, you can replace it later. If it is soldered to the board, the number you buy is the number you own for the life of the machine. Thin and light laptops almost always solder because LPDDR5X is designed to be soldered. In a normal year, you could shrug at this and upgrade later. In this year, with memory priced the way it is, upgrading later is the expensive path, so the capacity you choose at the counter is close to final. And here is the one piece of genuinely good news in this whole story. There is a newer standard called LPDDR-CAM2. It takes the same LPDDR5X memory packages a maker would have soldered down and puts them on a module you can actually remove. You keep the speed and a low power draw of soldered memory, and you get replaceability back. Lenovo's ThinkBook 14 Plus and 16 Plus for 2026 are the first mainstream laptops to ship it, using LPDDR5X at 8533 alongside Panther Lake processors. Samsung is bringing modules up to 96 gigabytes. If you are shopping thin and light, this is now a spec worth hunting for.
On speeds, keep it in proportion. A current Panther Lake laptop supports LPDDR5X up to 9600 or regular DDR5 up to 7200 across 2 channels to a ceiling of 128 gigabytes with PCIe 5 for storage. Those are the platform limits, not a shopping target. Between 2 machines, having enough capacity in 2 channels matters far more than a few hundred megahertz on the memory rating.
Storage next, and the same shortage applies. Flash memory went up alongside DRAM, which is why the free upgrade to a bigger drive has quietly disappeared from a lot of listings. So it is worth knowing which storage numbers actually change how a machine feels, and which ones are just large numbers on a box.
The jump that genuinely changes a computer is from a mechanical hard disk or an older SATA drive to any NVMe solid-state drive. That is the difference you feel every time the machine boots or opens something. After that, the gains get small fast. A machine with an NVMe drive already feels immediate. A faster NVMe drive mostly makes a benchmark look better.
The generation numbers describe how much bandwidth each lane carries, and an NVMe drive uses 4 lanes. That puts a Generation 3 drive around 3.5 gigabytes a second, a Generation 4 drive around 7, and a Generation 5 drive somewhere between 10 and 14. Those figures are real. What matters is whether anything you do can consume them.
And in a laptop, mostly it cannot. Game loading and everyday work are limited by other parts of the system long before the drive becomes the bottleneck, so the extra speed does not show up. What does show up is heat. A Generation 5 drive runs hotter, and in a thin chassis with limited airflow, it throttles sooner. which means you can pay more and end up slower under a sustained load. Do not let a Generation 5 badge decide a laptop purchase. Here is the trap that actually bites, and it is never on the spec sheet. Cheap drives leave out the DRAM cache and instead keep a small, fast region to absorb writes. Short bursts hit that region and look excellent, but when you write something large and sustained, copying a project folder or letting a video editor use the drive as scratch space, that region fills and speed falls off a cliff to a fraction of the advertised figure. If you edit video, a drive with its own DRAM cache is worth more than a bigger generation number.
On capacity, 512 gigabytes is a workable floor, 1 terabyte is comfortable, and 2 or more is creator territory once you are keeping footage. Storage is the one thing on this list that is still often upgradable, so count the M.2 slots before you buy. A second empty slot is worth real money this year. But if the machine has only 1 slot and it is filled, treat the capacity the same way as soldered memory. What you buy is what you keep.
So, the whole section as a checklist. 16 gigabytes minimum, 32 if you create, 2 sticks rather than 1. Find out whether it is soldered and prefer LPCAMM2 if it is a thin machine. Any NVMe drive. Generation 4 is plenty, with its own DRAM cache if you edit. 512 gigabytes minimum, 1 terabyte if you can. Count the M.2 slots and specify all of it at purchase, because this is the year where upgrading later costs more than buying right.
Which leaves the one component you will actually stare at for every hour you own the machine, and the one where budget listings tell the most creative lies: the screen.
The display is the part of the computer you actually experience. Every hour you spend on this machine, you spend looking at this one component. It is also where the spec sheet does the most creative writing of anywhere in the listing. So this section is mostly about learning which numbers are real. Start with the single most common trick in budget listings. You will see a screen advertised as 45% NTSC. That sounds like a number that means something. Here is what it converts to, roughly 62% sRGB. NTSC is an old broadcast standard, and it is quoted precisely because the number looks larger than the honest one. A panel at 62% sRGB cannot show you accurate color. It is not a colorwork screen, and no amount of calibration fixes a gamut the panel cannot physically reach. So here is the honest ladder. 100% sRGB is the floor for any work where color matters. That includes editing photos for a client or grading video that other people will watch. DCI-P3 is the target for video and HDR work. Adobe RGB matters if your output is print. And if none of that is you, if the machine is for documents and browsing, then sRGB coverage simply stops being a deciding factor, and you should spend that money on brightness instead. Brightness is measured in nits, and this is the number that decides whether you can use the laptop near a window. 250 nits is poor, usable in a dim room and frustrating anywhere else. 300 is acceptable. 400 and above is genuinely good and handles a bright room. 600 is where HDR starts to mean anything, and 1,000 or more only comes from mini LED or OLED panels. If you work in daylight, brightness will affect your day far more than color gamut will.
3 panel technologies, and the choice is simpler than the marketing suggests. TN panels are cheap and fast, and they wash out the moment you look at them slightly off angle. Avoid them unless you are buying purely on price. IPS is the sensible default. Accurate color, wide viewing angles, and no unpleasant surprises. OLED is different in kind because every pixel makes its own light and can switch off completely, which gives you true black and contrast that an IPS panel cannot reach.
Now, burn-in handled honestly in both directions. It is a real wear mechanism on OLED. A pixel that makes its own light ages, and one that shows a static taskbar for years ages differently from its neighbors. It is physically impossible on IPS because those pixels do not emit light at all. But modern panels ship pixel shifting, logo dimming, and gleaning cycles, and in practice, the risk is much smaller than its reputation. So the honest rule is narrow. If this machine will sit on the same static interface all day, every day, choose IPS. For mixed use, OLED is a real upgrade, and the fear is overblown.
And what assumption worth breaking because it is so widely held? People assume the fancier panel makes the laptop heavier. Not necessarily. Notebook Check weighed both versions of the same machine, the ThinkPad X1 Carbon Generation 14. The OLED model came in at 989 grams, and the IPS model was heavier at 1.14 kilograms. Same laptop, different panel, and the supposedly premium option was the lighter one. Panel choice can change more about a machine than the picture.
Refresh rate. Above 60 Hz, the improvement is real, but it is narrow. It shows up in games and in the feel of scrolling and moving a cursor. It does nothing for video, because video is mastered at 24 or 30 frames a second, and a faster panel cannot invent frames that were never shot. It also costs battery. So 120 Hz is a pleasant upgrade for general use, and 240 Hz on a machine that will run spreadsheets is money set on fire. Resolution only means something next to screen size, because what your eye notices is pixel density. 1920 by 1080 is perfectly sharp on a 14-inch laptop and starts looking coarse by 17 inches. Going higher costs battery, and on Windows you will still occasionally meet an application that scales badly and renders tiny text. So match the resolution to the panel size rather than chasing the biggest number available.
The display decided. Ignore any NTSC figure completely. Demand 100% sRGB if color is part of your work, and stop caring about gamut if it is not. 300 nits minimum, 400 if you sit near daylight, IPS as the default, OLED if you want contrast and your day is not one static screen. 120 Hz is a nice upgrade, above that only for games, and match resolution to panel size.
Which brings us to the thing that quietly decides whether any of the components we have discussed actually perform the way their spec sheets promise. Heat.
Everything we have talked about so far, the processor, the graphics chip, the drive, every one of them has two performance figures, the one on the box and the one it can actually hold. Cooling is what decides which of those two you paid for.
A boost figure is what a chip reaches for a few seconds when it is cold. A sustained figure is what it holds after 20 minutes of real work when the chassis is heated up and the fans are already at maximum. Boost numbers are marketing. Sustained numbers are the machine. And the gap between them is set almost entirely by how much heat the laptop can move, which is why two laptops with identical spec sheets can perform very differently.
So what do you actually look at? Count the heat pipes. More copper moving heat away is straightforwardly better. Look for a vapor chamber on anything with serious graphics. Count the fans and note their size, because two larger fans move more air at a lower noise level than one small fan screaming. And look at where the intakes and exhausts are, because a machine that exhausts into its own hinge or vents onto your desk is fighting itself.
And this connects directly back to the graphics section. Remember that the same graphics chip can be given very different power budgets, and that reviewers measure a 15 to 20% frame rate spread because of it. Thickness is where that comes from. A thin chassis physically cannot move the heat that a higher power budget produces, so the maker lowers the budget. You are not choosing between thin and thick. You are choosing between portable and fast, and you should decide which one you actually need before you look at any spec sheet. If you can get your hands on the machine or find a review that did this, there is one test worth more than every benchmark chart combined. Put a sustained load on it for 30 minutes, along export, along render, along game, and then look at the clock speeds and the temperatures at the end, not at the start. That final number is the machine you are buying. Everything before it is a sales pitch. Ports. This is a small section that will save somebody watching a genuine amount of money and annoyance. Because a USB-C port is not one thing, it is a shape. What that shape can actually do varies enormously, and listings routinely do not say. Check three things separately, because they are genuinely separate. 1. Does the port carry video, so you can drive a monitor from it? 2. Can it charge the laptop, or is charging locked to a barrel connector? 3. What is its actual data speed? Because two ports that look identical can differ by a factor of 8. Then check the HDMI version if you intend to run a high refresh rate display, and count how many ports you lose the moment the charger is plugged in. Thunderbolt is worth understanding because it is the one port specification that is actually strict. Thunderbolt 4 tops out at 40 gigabits per second. Thunderbolt 5 doubles that to 80 gigabits in both directions at once, and can push up to 120 gigabits one way when a demanding display needs it. It also carries up to 240 watts of charging, so this is a real doubling, not a renamming. If you plan to run an external drive array or a single cable dock that drives monitors and charges the laptop, this is the port that makes it work. Battery. Ignore the hours of manufacturer quotes, because those are measured in conditions you will never reproduce. Screen dimmed, radios off, one video looping.
The number worth comparing is watt-hours, which is the actual size of the tank. But size alone does not decide runtime either. A large battery and a machine with a hungry, discrete graphics chip can easily last less time than a smaller battery in an efficient, thin laptop. Compare watt-hours between machines of the same kind, and treat quoted hours as fiction.
Now, the part no spec sheet is ever listed. The components in a laptop very rarely fail. What fails is mechanical. The hinge, after a few thousand open and close cycles. The port solder joints, after a cable has been yanked enough times. The keyboard, after a few million keystrokes. None of that appears in a comparison table, which is exactly why reading one long-term owner report is worth more than comparing two spec sheets side by side.
And while we are on the things no spec sheet describes, the keyboard and the trackpad, you touch these every single minute the machine is open, and no listing will tell you how they feel. 3 things to check if you can put your hands on it. Key travel, which is how far the key moves before it registers, whether the deck flexes when you press firmly in the middle, and whether the trackpad is glass or plastic, because glass is a different experience entirely. If you cannot try it, find a review that talks about these explicitly, rather than one that just lists parts.
Camera, microphone, and speakers are where money gets saved quietly, because almost nobody asks about them. If you are in calls or online classes every day, these matter more to you than a faster processor. A 1080p camera is the sensible floor now. 720p is a cost cut, and it looks like one. Check for a physical privacy shutter and for a dual microphone array rather than a single pinhole. And on security, a fingerprint reader or an infrared camera is a real daily convenience, not a luxury. Note that Windows Hello Face Sign-In needs the infrared camera specifically. An ordinary webcam cannot do it.
Warranty is where the brand on the lid finally does matter. Not because it built the machine, but because it decides what happens when the machine breaks. Check whether the cover is on-site or carry-in, because carrying a 17-inch laptop across a city is a different experience to a technician arriving. Check whether accidental damage cover is offered at all, and check how far the service network actually reaches from where you live, not from the nearest metro. If the machine is for business, keep the GST invoice.
One quick compatibility check. Windows 10 stopped receiving support on the 14th of October 2025, so any machine you buy now needs to be Windows 11 capable, which in practice means it needs TPM 2.0. Every current laptop clears this easily. It only becomes a real question if you are looking at used or older stock, which is exactly where we are going next.
Because of everything the memory shortage did to new prices, used and manufacturer refurbished machines are a genuinely better idea this year than they usually are. A 2-year-old machine was built with memory and storage but at normal prices. That is a real advantage, and it is worth taking seriously, carefully.
Here is how to do it without regret. Prefer manufacturer refurbished with a warranty over a private sale, even at a higher price. You are buying recourse. Check the battery cycle count and reported health, not how it feels. Confirm the panel specification yourself rather than trusting the listing, because a resold machine carries whatever cheap panel it originally shipped with. Ask for the original invoice for any remaining warranty, and run a sustained load before money changes hands, if you possibly can.
And one specific warning, which applies to used desktops only. Intel 13th and 14th generation desktop processors had a real instability problem caused by a circuit inside the core degrading under elevated voltage over time. A microcode update prevents further damage, but it cannot undo damage already done. So if you are buying a used desktop with one of those chips, you need the seller to show you a current BIOS and Intel default settings. Laptops were never affected by this. Do not let it scare you off a used 13th generation laptop.
So, money. I am going to give you bands rather than prices because memory is moving fast enough this year that any exact figure would be wrong within weeks. Under 40,000 buys browsing, documents, and media. 40 to 60,000 is the student all-rounder. 60 to 85,000 is entry creator and gaming. This is where a dedicated graphics chip becomes realistic. 85,000 to 1.2 lakh is serious creator territory. Above 1.2 lakh, you are into workstation class machines.
More useful than the bands is knowing where to spend inside one. Given a fixed budget, the order that produces the best machine is almost always the same. Enough memory first, because you cannot fix it later this year. Then the screen, because you look at it every hour. Then cooling, because it governs what everything else actually delivers. Then the graphics chip, if your work needs one. and the processor last because the difference between adjacent processor tiers is the smallest real-world difference on this entire list.
That is the whole Windows and PC side of the decision, which leaves the question that comes up every single time somebody asks for advice and deserves a straight answer rather than a tribal one. What about a MacBook?
Right, MacBooks. This question comes up every single time somebody asks for buying advice, and it usually gets answered by whichever camp the person answering belongs to. So let us do it properly. What Apple actually sells right now, what is genuinely better about it, and what is genuinely worse.
As things stand, the range runs like this. At the bottom, there is the MacBook Neo, a 13-inch machine that launched in March 2026. Then, the MacBook Air in 13 and 15-inch sizes on the M4 chip with an M5 13-inch as well. Then, the MacBook Pro 14-inch on M5. And at the top, the MacBook Pro in 14 and 16-inch with M5 Pro and M5 Max. The plain M5 arrived in October 2025, and the Pro and Max versions in March 2026.
The Neo is the interesting one because it is the cheapest laptop Apple has ever sold. 13-inch liquid retina display, 500 nits of brightness, which by the standard we set in the display section is genuinely good, not merely acceptable. It ships with 256 gigabytes of storage, and 512 is the only upgrade offered. 4 colors. It is Apple finally competing at a price where most people actually shop.
And here is the detail that ties this whole film together. In June 2026, Apple raised the price of the Neo from $599 to $699 and raised prices across the Mac line. The stated reason was the cost of memory. This is the cleanest proof available that the shortage we have been discussing is not an abstract component market story. It reached the finished laptop at the most price-sensitive company in the industry.
The chips themselves, the plain M5 gives you 9 or 10 CPU cores, 8 or 10 GPU cores, and memory options from 12 up to 32 gigabytes. The M5 Pro moves to 15 or 18 CPU cores, 16 or 20 GPU cores, and 24 to 64 gigabytes. The M5 Max is 18 CPU cores, 32 or 40 GPU cores, and memory from 36 all the way to 128 gigabytes. Notice that the meaningful difference between these tiers is as much about memory ceiling as it is about cores.
One architectural note, and I am flagging this as Apple's own claim rather than an independent measurement. Apple says the M5 Pro and M5 Max use what it calls a fusion architecture, joining 2 dies into a single chip with a new 18-core CPU design. That is the company describing its own product, so treat the framing accordingly, but the core counts and the memory ceilings that come with it are real and verifiable.
Now, the single most useful thing in this entire section, and it is not a chip, the MacBook Air has no fan. The MacBook Pro does. That one difference is the buying decision. The Air is genuinely excellent, silent, cool, superb battery, right up until a load runs long enough to heat-soak the aluminum. Then it throttles, and the Pro does not, which is exactly the boost versus sustained argument from the cooling section appearing again in a completely different product line. If your work is bursts, buy the Air. If your work is long exports and long renders, you need the fan.
Unified memory needs explaining properly because it is genuinely different and it gets described badly. On a Windows laptop, you have system RAM for the processor and separate VRAM soldered next to the graphics chip, and data gets copied between them. On these Macs, there is one pool of memory, and the processor and the graphics cores both address it directly. No copying. That is why comparing Apple's memory number to a Windows machine's VRAM number is not a like-for-like comparison at all. But here is the cost of that design, and it is the most important sentence in this section. Unified memory is part of the chip package. It can never be upgraded. Not by you, not by a service center, not ever. The configuration you choose at checkout is the configuration you own until you sell the machine. We said earlier that soldered memory makes the purchase decision close to final. On a Mac, it is not close to final. It is final. And in a year when memory pricing looks like this, that is the most expensive thing in this whole film to get wrong. On storage, Apple has actually moved in the buyer's favor at the top of the range. The M5 Pro machines start at 1 terabyte, and the M5 Max starts at 2. Those are sensible floors. They match the recommendation we made in the storage section rather than undercutting it. The catch is the same as with memory. It is not upgradable either, so the same logic applies. Decide once at checkout, properly.
And now the genuinely strong argument for a Mac, which is specific rather than vague. Because the graphics cores address that same single pool, an M5 Max configured with 128 gigabytes can hold local AI models that no consumer graphics card can fit. Remember from the graphics section that even a good laptop card gives you 8 to 12 gigabytes of VRAM. The M5 Max also moves data at 460 gigabytes a second with the 32-core GPU or 614 with the 40-core version. If running large models locally is your actual work, this is a real and specific reason to buy a Mac, not a preference.
Every M5 variant carries a 16-core neural engine rated at 42 trillion operations per second. For context, the Copilot Plus requirement on the Windows side is 40, so Apple clears that bar across its entire current range, including the cheap machines, which is not something you can assume on a Windows laptop at the same price.
On connectivity, the Pro machines use Apple's own wireless chip with Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 6, and Thunderbolt 5. That is the same Thunderbolt 5 we covered in the port section, 80 gigabits each way, up to 120 in boost. So the single cable dock setup works properly here, which is worth knowing if that is how you want to work at a desk.
So when is a Mac clearly the right answer? If you want long, real battery life without carrying a charger, the Air is very hard to beat. If you run large AI models locally, the big unified memory configurations do something no consumer graphics card can. If you want silence, the fanless Air is genuinely silent, not quiet. If you edit video in Final Cut or work in an Apple-centric studio pipeline, the software is built for the hardware. And if you value the machine still feeling solid in 4 years, the build and the resale value are real.
And now the other side, just as bluntly. If you game, this is the wrong machine. The library is not there, and anti-cheat support is worse, not better. If your work depends on CUDA, which, as we covered, is still the path of least resistance for a lot of AI and 3D tooling, you are choosing a harder road. If you want to upgrade memory or storage later, you cannot, at all. If you need specific Windows-only professional software, check before you switch, not after. And configuring a Mac to a high memory and storage tier is expensive in a way that a Windows machine with slots simply is not.
The Mac decision as a checklist. Air if your work is bursts. Pro if it is long sustained loads. That is the fan. Buy all the unified memory you will ever need right now because there is no second chance. Same for storage. The Neo is a real option at the bottom of the range now, with a better screen than most laptops at its price. And check your must-have software runs on it before you commit, not after the box is open.
Which leaves one last question, and for a lot of people, it is the one that actually saves them the most money. Should you be buying a laptop at all? Or should you be building a desktop? So, should you be buying a laptop at all? I have deliberately left this until the end, because you cannot answer it properly until you understand power budgets and cooling, and now you do. This is also the part where the biggest amount of money is usually saved. Here is the fact that settles the argument. Take the most powerful graphics card NVIDIA currently sells, the RTX 5090. In a desktop, it is a 575-watt part with 32 gigabytes of memory. The laptop version of the same name runs at roughly a quarter of that power with 24 gigabytes. Same badge on the box, different piece of hardware. This is not NVIDIA being dishonest. A laptop physically cannot supply or remove 575 watts. It is simply what the form factor costs you. And this is the thread running through the entire video. Watts in means heat out, and heat out means cooling, and cooling means physical volume. A desktop has volume to spare, so it can run big fans slowly and quietly and never throttle. A laptop has none, so every design decision inside it is a compromise against heat. That is why the same chip name gives you a 15 to 20% spread between laptops, and a far bigger gap than that between a laptop and a desktop. So on equal money, a desktop gives you more of everything that matters. Substantially more performance because nothing is power limited. Quieter operation because big fans move air slowly. Full sustained speed because there is nowhere for heat to build up. Every part replaceable, including the memory and storage that we just spent 2 sections explaining you cannot change on a laptop. And repairability. One failed part is one replaced part, not a service center and a 2-week wait. And to be fair in the other direction, because this is not a one-sided argument, a laptop gives you the entire computer in one object. Screen, keyboard, battery, all of it.
already matched and already working. It runs when the power is out. It works on a train, in a hostel room, at a client's office. And for a very large number of people, the honest truth is that a computer they cannot carry is a computer they will not use.
So the question is not which is better. The question is much simpler and much more personal. How often do you genuinely move the machine while you are working on it? Not how often you imagine you might. If the honest answer is that it lives on one desk and gets moved twice a year, you are paying a very large performance tax for portability you are not using.
And here is the recommendation that saves the most money, which almost nobody considers. If your work is heavy, but you also need to be mobile sometimes, a modest laptop plus a desktop very often beats one expensive laptop for the same total spend. The desktop does the heavy work properly with real cooling and upgradable parts. The cheap laptop handles notes, email, and travel. You get a better machine for the hard jobs and a lighter machine for the road, instead of one compromised machine doing both badly.
If that convinced you, here is what actually matters when you build one. Kept to the decisions that have consequences, not a parts list that will be out of date in a month. 2 current platforms. On the AMD side, socket AM5 with chipsets B650, B850, X670, and X870. On the Intel side, socket LGA 1851 with B860 and Z890. The chipset letter mostly decides how many fast ports and how much overclocking headroom you get, not how fast the processor is. A cheaper board with the same socket runs the same chip.
And here is a genuine longevity argument that laptops simply cannot offer. AMD has confirmed that Zen 6, its next desktop architecture, stays on socket AM5. Zen 6 is expected around late 2026 for data center and the first half of 2027 for desktop. So a board you buy today can very plausibly take a processor 2 generations newer without replacing the board or the memory. That is the kind of upgrade path that does not exist in any laptop at any price.
Now, the component people cut to save money, and the only one where that decision can damage everything else in the case. Buy a reputable power supply with an 80+ rating and real headroom above what you calculate, because modern graphics cards draw very short spikes far above their rated figure. On a current build, look for ATX 3.1 with a native 12-volt 2x6 cable rather than an adapter. This is not the place to save 2,000 rupees.
And one specific physical warning that has cost people real hardware. RTX 50 desktop cards require the 16-pin 12-volt 2x6 connector. It must be pushed fully home. Poorly seated connectors and cases where current is shared unevenly across the pins have produced melted connectors and a measured hotspot of around 150 degrees. Push it in until it clicks, check it after cable management, and do not run it through a chain of adapters.
The memory shortage applies to a desktop build exactly as it does to a laptop, so the same rules hold. Buy the capacity you need now. 2 sticks, not 1, to fill both channels. The one real advantage is that a desktop board has empty slots, so if prices ever do fall, you genuinely can add more later, which is a freedom the soldered machines in this video simply do not have. The spending order changes slightly for a desktop because you are buying the screen separately. Graphics card first if your work needs one, since that is where desktop money goes furthest. Then a power supply you trust. Then memory at the capacity you need. Then storage. Then the processor. Then the case and cooling. And budget for the monitor as its own purchase. Apply the same display rules we covered earlier, because a great tower behind a bad panel is a bad computer.
You do not have to assemble it yourself. A pre-built machine from a reputable shop gets you a single warranty covering the whole system, which is genuinely worth something when a fault is hard to isolate. The thing to check is where they saved money, and it is almost always the power supply and the cooling, the 2 parts a buyer never asks about. Ask for the exact power supply model and the exact case fan count before you agree.
The desktop decision as a checklist. Answer honestly whether you move the machine. Consider a cheap laptop plus a desktop rather than one expensive laptop. On AMD, socket AM5 has a confirmed upgrade path. Do not cut the power supply. 80+ with headroom and ATX 3.1. Seat the 12-volt 2x6 connector fully, 2 memory sticks, and buy the monitor to the same standard as the tower. So the verdict stated plainly: if the machine lives on a desk, build or buy a desktop. You will get more computer for the money, and you will keep it longer. If you genuinely work in more than one place, buy a laptop and use everything in this video to buy a good one rather than an expensive one. And if you need both kinds of work, buy both cheaply rather than one thing expensively.
That is every component covered. Let us put the whole thing together into something you can actually use in a shop. So that is every component. Now let us compress all of it into something you can hold in your head while you are standing in a shop with a salesperson talking at you.
6 ideas carry this entire video. 1. The badge on the lid did not build the machine, so judge the components, not the brand. 2. A model number has 2 separate axes, the tier and the generation, and confusing them is the single most common mistake there is. 3. A dedicated graphics chip with its own memory is the line between an office laptop and a creator laptop, and no processor compensates for its absence. 4. Boost numbers are marketing, and sustained numbers are the machine, which makes cooling the component that governs all the others. 5. Watts in means heat out, which is why the same chip name means different hardware in different chassis. And 6. This year, buy the memory and storage you need at the counter, because upgrading later is the expensive path.
Here is the whole decision as a tree, and notice where it starts, not with a budget and not with a brand. It starts with what you actually do. If that is documents, browsing, and video, you want a thin and light machine, 16 gigabytes, 100% sRGB panel, good battery, or a MacBook Air if silence and battery matter most. If it is 3D, editing, visual effects, local AI, or game development, you need a performance laptop with a real dedicated graphics chip, 12 gigabytes or more VRAM, and cooling that can hold it. And if that machine is not actually going to leave your desk, the same money buys you far more as a desktop.
And this is the frame to pause and screenshot. 12 things to check before you pay, in order. 16 gigabytes of memory minimum, 32 if you create. 2 sticks, not 1. Ask whether it is soldered. Any NVMe drive, 512 gigabytes minimum. 100% sRGB if color is your work. 300 nits minimum, 400 near daylight. Ignore every NTSC figure. If there is a dedicated graphics chip, find its wattage. Count the heat pipes and the fans. Check the ports carry video and power. Check the warranty type and whether service reaches your town. And read one long-term owner report before you commit.
And the specific traps, named plainly so they stick. 45% NTSC is about 62% sRGB, and it is quoted because it sounds bigger. There is no 12GB RTX 3050. If a listing says so, the listing is wrong. Frame generation raises the number on screen, but does not make the game respond faster. A single memory stick quietly halves your bandwidth. The Intel 13th and 14th generation instability problem was desktop only, so do not let it scare you off a used laptop. And Generation FAG drive in a thin laptop mostly buys you heat.
One last thing that is specific to right now, because it inverts advice that was correct for a decade. The memory shortage is real. It is severe, and nobody serious expects relief before 2028. Even Apple raised its prices over it. For 10 years, the right advice was buy light and upgrade later. In 2026, that advice is wrong. Specify the memory and the storage you actually need at the moment of purchase, because later is more expensive than now, and on a lot of machines, later is not possible at all.
And the thing I would most like you to take away, you do not need to know more than a salesperson to buy well. You only need to ask about the components instead of the brand, and to be honest with yourself about what you actually do with the computer rather than what you imagine you might. Every mistake in this video comes from one of those 2 things being skipped. Every figure in this video came from a specific source, and all of them are listed in the description. Intel and AMD and NVIDIA and Apple's own specifications, TrendForce and Gartner for the memory market, and reviewer measurements for anything about sustained performance. Where something was a company's own claim rather than an independent measurement, I said so at the time. If you think any of it is wrong, tell me in the comments and bring the source, and I will correct it in a pinned comment. That is the whole thing. If it helped, subscribe. This channel makes long, careful explanations of exactly this kind, in English and in Hinglish. If you are about to buy something and you are still not sure, put the spec sheet in the comments and I will tell you what I think of it. Thanks for watching all the way through. This has been Thunderbolt.